From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please do so at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your listening. This week, the first week of the second Trump administration, I actually find myself in Davos, Switzerland for the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. And now while we're over here in Switzerland, of course, events back in the United States, particularly in Washington, have dominated proceedings. It's fair to say the mood here is interested, cautious, looking forward to see what President Donald Trump will do. A lot of nervousness about what he may do in terms of economic relations, tariffs. Also some nervousness about what may happen more broadly with the geopolitical situation. But of course, one of the early challenges he faces is the war in Ukraine. Of course, he promised during the election campaign that he would bring an end to the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. As we record this today on Thursday, he's missed that deadline, but we do know that a lot of interesting diplomatic activity has been going on, and it is very much Trump's ambition to try and bring about an end to that war, which will have been going for 3 years next month. And in fact, on Wednesday, he issued what looked like a strong indication of what Trump administration's approach may be to Vladimir Putin and to the war, saying that while he had a lot of sympathy with Russia and liked Vladimir Putin and respected him, Russia had lost a lot of people in that war. The war was becoming increasing drain on Russia, and Russia had a strong interest in ending the war. But if they didn't agree to some sort of a deal that would settle the war, then Trump, for the first time, threatened additional sanctions on Russia, economic and financial sanctions at least, if not more military assistance for Ukraine. So it's clear that there is strong diplomatic activity going on. There's an attempt to put some pressure on Russia there to come to a deal. There's already certainly pressure on Ukraine to come to a deal. They've been suffering military setbacks, and of course they're not going to be receiving any more military aid with Trump now in office and with a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. So what's going to happen? What are the prospects for peace? What are the prospects for a deal? And what might that deal look like? And if it doesn't happen, how long does this war go on? And what are its longer term implications? Well, to talk about that this week, I'm joined by someone who knows Russia well, who knows Vladimir Putin very well, and that's Bill Browder. Bill Browder is a British-American investor. He was knighted by His Majesty King Charles just recently. He's become a British citizen, and he is now Sir William Browder, so congratulations to him for that. He's well known in the international investing community, particularly with regard to Russia. Spent a lot of time in Russia in the early part of this century, butting heads, as it turns out, with many of the oligarchs that surround Vladimir Putin. And eventually he was actually ejected and deported from Russia. And following that, he was very influential in the US establishing sanctions against Russia over human rights after the death of Bill Browder's lawyer in Moscow, Sergei Magnitsky, and that led to the so-called Magnitsky Act that was passed by Congress, as I say, which imposes sanctions on Russia over human rights abuses. Bill's been a very strong and ardent campaigner against Vladimir Putin and an ardent campaigner on behalf of Ukraine. But he's spent a lot of time there and he knows what's going on, and I'm delighted to say that I have the opportunity to talk to him and what he thinks about the new Trump administration's approach, whether or not a deal is possible. And Bill Browder joins me now. Bill, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Great to be here.
Lots to talk about. We're here at Davos, I should say, at the World Economic Forum. Seeing you've been speaking and you've been having lots of interesting conversations. Let's talk obviously about the elephant not in the room, as it were, which is the new president just taken office in the US, is dominating proceedings here, even though he's not here in person, although we're recording this on Thursday. He's speaking remotely here on Thursday. And particularly, let's talk about the inevitable conversation that we want to get to, which is Russia and Ukraine. He issued that quite interesting statement yesterday where he talked about the need for peace. I mean, he did promise, of course, before he took office that he would solve the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 24 hours. He hasn't quite achieved it on that timetable. But he has talked in this quite interesting statement yesterday. I don't think we've really heard before about expressing sympathy for Russia, as he often does, and admiration for Vladimir Putin, but with a little hint of menace there that if Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table quickly and doesn't do a deal, then the US could increase not military aid but sanctions, economic and financial sanctions on Russia. What's your reading of either of that or more generally of what Trump, the new administration, will do in terms of trying to bring about some kind of a settlement in Ukraine?
You know, so he started out by saying back in the day on the campaign trail, we're going to solve this problem in 24 hours after I'm elected, before I'm even inaugurated. And of course, that was just hyperbole and rhetoric and you know, the typical politician stuff. But the people working for him then all of a sudden had this like big challenge, like how are we going to solve this problem in 24 hours or whatever the length of time is? And of course, it stretched out from 24 hours to 100 days. And then what happened, which was interesting, is that we started to see these sort of contours of a quote, peace plan. And the contours, you had Waltz, the national security advisor, and Kellogg, the special envoy, sort of either leaking or briefing allies, journalists on this sort of idea, which was that you would stop the conflict on the current lines that they're on, that Ukraine would make some commitment not to join NATO, and that the Europeans would then provide some type of peacekeeping force. That was the basic contours. And whether you like it or dislike it, and of course I dislike it, because why would you want to reward Putin with any territory at all? But put my opinions aside, this was like playing a game of fantasy football. We were all just sitting in a room by ourselves, sort of picking our favorite players for our fantasy team. This had nothing to do with reality. And the reality is that Zelensky, of course, had showed up, said, I'm ready to negotiate. And of course, these guys are all thinking what might be acceptable for some group of people. But nobody had bothered to say, well, what's Vladimir Putin going to do when we actually present him with this? And the one perspective that I bring, a different perspective that I bring, is that I've spent the last 15 years in a man-to-man, head-to-head conflict with Vladimir Putin. And the one thing I've learned about Vladimir Putin is that he has no capacity whatsoever in any situation ever to compromise. If you were playing a game of poker with Vladimir Putin, he would always raise, he would always bluff, and he would always move forward, no matter how bad a hand he had. And what I know about Vladimir Putin is that the reason he went into Ukraine has much less to do with NATO enlargement, much less to do with any visions of an imperial Russia, and everything to do with him being a guy who's desperate to stay in power. He's been around for 25 years. Every time he's feeling weak and that people will not be happy with him, he starts a war. He went into Chechnya to start his presidency, and his approval ratings went up. He went into Georgia in 2008, his approval ratings went up. He went into Crimea, his approval ratings went up. And he went into Ukraine for his approval ratings. And so he's in this game for one simple reason, which is that if he loses power, he then loses all the money that he's stolen, he goes to jail, and he probably gets killed. Yeah. This is a guy who's desperate to stay in power, to stay alive. And so being in Ukraine is not about anything that General Kellogg has laid out in his peace plan. So if we could somehow guarantee that Vladimir Putin doesn't die and he can sort of have a happy life with his $200 or $300 billion of stolen money, that's probably the kind of peace plan he'd like, but not some nonsense where we're drawing lines in strange places that he would never be happy with.
Okay, well, that's a very bleak picture. First of all, I mean, how does that square with the art of the deal? We have as our president the ultimate deal maker, right? Everything's about deal making. You say Putin just doesn't compromise. The whole ideas on which any deal is based is that both sides, at least one side, but probably both sides usually have to compromise. How is Trump going to be able to pull off a deal with a man who you say, by experience and instinct and everything else and political survival, does not compromise?
Well, there's only one way. So there's one moment at which Putin would do a deal, and that is if he has no other option. And how do you put him in a situation where he has no other option? It's like the boot on the throat. You've got to make sure that things are going so catastrophically badly for him, militarily, economically, geopolitically, that the least worst option for him is to compromise. That's the only situation in which he'll do that.
But that's not the situation right now. And I do think one of the concerns that people who obviously want to bring about a peaceful settlement, and including even some who maybe, unlike you, maybe will accept that there is some degree of territorial concession that Ukraine has to make, that Putin does seem to have the upper hand right now. Okay, that war has ebbed and flowed. It's been going on for 3 years now. Initially, everybody thought it'd be over in a month. It wasn't. Then Ukraine was on the offensive. Now it does look as though everything I hear, and you tell me because you know more about it, but everything I hear and read is that Russia's been steadily advancing, making bigger gains than it's made since the early days of the war. Ukraine is very much kind of on the back foot. First of all, tell me if that's true, and if it is true that Putin seems to at least have re-established some kind of upper hand, why on earth would he do a deal, as you say, if the boot is not on his neck, and if anything, it might be the other way around?
Well, the answer is he's not going to do a deal. But I want to just comment on one thing you said, which is that Putin is not in as strong a position as he's thumping his chest and telling us everything is good. The amount of territory they've gained is de minimis compared to the amount of soldiers that they've lost. I mean, they lose 1,500 soldiers a day. The equipment that they've lost since the beginning of this war is incalculable.
Tens of millions. I mean, we've seen the Russian ability to take casualties in multiple wars. It's unlimited.
And that's the key, is that he can basically take the pain no matter what. And so it's not a question that he's got the upper hand. It's just that the question is that he can stomach so much more pain. America hasn't even stomached any pain. Okay, so part of the campaign of or some people, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, are saying, why are we spending all this money on Ukraine? This is 5% of the U.S. military budget to completely dismember either our first or second biggest adversary without a single loss of an American life. So there's no pain that we're experiencing, but somehow we're experiencing pain and Putin's not experiencing pain. It makes no sense.
But do you really think, and it sounds like you do, and we can talk about how we get there, but again, everything I pick up, including from some Ukrainians, is that, the prospect of actually rolling back what the territory that Russia has taken, obviously Crimea, which they took years ago, more than a decade ago, but that eastern part of Ukraine and along the shore there, the Donbass and the Zaporizhia, those regions they've taken, do you really think that they can be recovered militarily by Ukraine?
It's very hard to say. If you remember, Russia took a whole bunch of territory at the very beginning, and then the Ukrainians pushed them back enormously. And so it's impossible for us sitting here in Davos, Switzerland, or New York or London to make any assessment of what's going on. If you remember, the best intelligence resources in the world said this war would last 3 days and Russia would roll into Kiev. And of course, we're now almost 3 years into this. And so I think it's impossible to make that assessment. But the one thing that the Ukrainians can do and have done and can continue to do is bring the war to Russia. So here we are saying that the only thing that Ukrainians can do is fight back in their own territory. And so the Russians can lob bombs on Kiev every day and on the power system and on people and on civilians, and the Ukrainians aren't allowed to fight back. And so there's a lot of economic targets in Russia that the Ukrainians can hit, and they can hit those targets so that the Russians feel the pain as well. And then if both sides feel the pain, then there's a greater chance that you can come to the table.
And hit them with U.S. weapons? Because as you know, it's not just the Tucker Carlsons or the Donald Trumps or the MAGA crowd who've been nervous about the U.S. giving Ukraine weapons that it then uses to strike Russian targets within Russia. It was the Biden administration that was extremely cautious about that. Do you think the risks of escalation are overblown there, that we could happily go on doing that and it wouldn't result in Putin, especially as he gets desperate? You've already talked about his ultimate need is to stay in power. Is there not a risk there that he escalates?
Well, that's his poker playing bluff, is he's just looking at us and saying, I'm going to raise and raise and raise. And we're saying, okay, we fold. So I think that the risk of escalation is greatest when we show weakness and appeasement. We started this whole thing saying no tanks for the Ukrainians because we don't want to escalate. We give them tanks. No long-range missiles. No jets. Every time he says, we're going to go to nuclear war. And he doesn't, because he understands that there are enormous costs to him of escalating. And he certainly doesn't want to have a war with us. I mean, if he can't beat the Ukrainians, he's not going to beat NATO. And so I think anybody who understands the Russian psychology, so if you were to speak to Alexei Navalny, God rest his soul, if he was still alive today, he would tell you the same thing that I'm telling you, which is the only way to deal with these people is with absolute strength and force. If you show weakness, they take advantage of it.
Started off talking about this diplomatic work that has been going on, I know, from obviously the now administration, but in the last few weeks as they were preparing to take office, the work that was being done by the Trump people and indeed to some extent by the Biden people, and this possible diplomatic effort that could, that Trump, with his apparent kind of démarche this week threatening tougher sanctions, you just think that's not going to work. There's no deal to be done.
So the only deal that could be done is a fake deal in which Putin makes a bunch of very vague commitments. Somehow we accept them and then sort of wash our hands of this war. And then some peacekeeping force gets put in. And then the Russians start firing on French and Belgian peacekeepers who aren't going to fire back. And then we have a Yugoslavia type of situation. The only deals that ever get done are fake deals, lying deals, deals that don't really matter, that aren't real deals. And I pray that Trump doesn't take some vague and empty promise from Putin as a way to sort of sell the Ukrainians down the river.
We've been arguing just this week, too, that one way, if the U.S. is not going to approve any more military aid to Ukraine after the Congress passed that last year, that there is this $300 billion or so of frozen Russian assets which could be used, essentially converted into military use. And you've forgotten more about international law than I will ever know. So, you can maybe talk about, some of the concerns that people may have about that from a legal perspective. But I've got more a practical political concern, which is, in addition to what we've just talked about the willingness of Russia to continue fighting and to sacrifice huge numbers of men and material in the fight, isn't it true that it seems that the Ukrainian will seems to be weakening somewhat? Zelensky is nothing like as popular as he was. There's kind of rising opposition to him. There's rising evidence that Ukrainians are tired of this war. 3 years, they've taken a huge amount of pummeling and damage and casualties and everything else. Is the idea of channeling hundreds of billions of dollars more so to keep this war going, and probably maybe just keep this war of attrition going for another 1, 2, 3 years? Is that something that is either desirable in itself or something the Ukrainians would even want to do?
Well, let's just be clear about what's happening here. The Russians have invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainians are defending their territory. When the Russians occupy Ukrainian territory, they rape the women, they tie the men's hands behind their backs, shoot them in the head and bury them in shallow graves and then kidnap their children. That's what happens when they occupy Ukraine. Why is Ukraine fighting back so valiantly? To prevent their women from being raped and their men from being shot with their hands tied behind their backs. So if you say to the Ukrainians, are you ready to give up? Are you ready to be subjugated to that kind of mass atrocity of your people? They'll say no. I was just at a breakfast with the Ukrainians this morning, and the soldiers were all giving talks about why they were fighting and what they were fighting for. And so the answer is, of course they're getting tired. They're exhausted. They're war weary. Does that mean that they want the Americans to just say, okay, no more weapons because we want to capitulate and die? Of course not. That's not what the Ukrainians' position is at all. They're desperate to continue to defend themselves. If it's become so unpopular in America, and other places for that matter, to continue funding the war, there's $300 billion of frozen Russian government money sitting in the accounts of the European Central Bank, of the Bank of England, of the U.S. Federal Reserve. That money is sitting there, and that money can be confiscated. Coming back to Trump's art of the deal, well, he's made a promise that, we're not going to waste any more money on Ukraine. Well, he doesn't have to. We can take Putin's money. This should appeal to Trump. And by the way, we're going to take Putin's money. Let's take Putin's money.
It's like getting the Mexicans to pay for the wall.
It's just like the Mexicans. It's a double benefit. And then spend the $300 billion on U.S. defense manufacturers to supply weapons so the Ukrainians can fight back and not have their women raped. I mean, that's got to be in the art of the deal.
Okay, so let's say there's no diplomatic solution to be had, as you say, other than maybe some sort of a bogus one that as you described from Putin. Let's say that you're not successful in that campaign to get that $300 billion released. What happens? And indeed, part of your argument for releasing that $300 billion is presumably what does happen if it doesn't happen. I mean, if that money is not released, does Putin finally get the victory that he's been trying for 3 years?
Let me tell you exactly what happens, and because we've seen a sort of real-life example of this. So in January of last year, there was a $50 billion U.S. military aid package, which was being considered by Congress. There was overwhelming bipartisan support for this piece of legislation. And Donald Trump called up the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, and said, I want to make sure that this does not go for vote. And so it didn't go for a vote because he had that kind of sway over Mike Johnson. And so what happened to the Ukrainians? As the days went by, the ammunition started to run out. And they started screaming louder and louder. And it got to the point where they were saying, if we don't have enough ammunition, the defensive lines are going to break. And finally, Trump made the phone call to Mike Johnson to have the vote. And of course, it was approved overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis. The Ukrainians got their money just in the nick of time. If that happens again, if the money runs out so they don't have ammunition, the front lines will break. We already talked about the atrocities that the Russians will commit in the occupied parts of Ukraine. What do the people do in the unraped, unmurdered people do in the unoccupied parts of Ukraine? Are they going to stick around? No. And so the first thing that happens is you have 15 to 20 million Ukrainian refugees fanning across Europe. Okay, so all of a sudden you have a refugee crisis like you've never seen before. The next thing that happens is Putin says, you know what? I've really got the upper hand now. I'm going to have a play on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania because they should have never been independent countries in the first place. The problem for us is that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are members of NATO.
Just sorry to interrupt, but you've already said that he's not going to take on NATO, right? One of the reasons he attacked Ukraine was precisely because Ukraine isn't in NATO and there's no Article 5 obligation on the rest of the NATO members to come to its defense. But would he really do that with NATO members?
Well, maybe he wants to test it out because there's also a history of Trump being particularly sort of dismissive of NATO. And so if he does that, is Trump going to go to war with Russia over Estonia, a country that if you do a survey of Americans, 99 out of 100 wouldn't even know where it was on a map? I think the answer is no. And if Trump says, I'm not going to do that, then are the rest of the NATO allies going to go and defend Estonia without the Americans? Probably not. And so then Putin gets Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then he makes a move on Poland. And then we end up with sort of World War II type situation in Europe, catastrophe. And for all the European countries, they're going to all have to increase their defense spending from 2% of GDP to 7%, and we're going to be in a world of hurt.
I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what you say, particularly on Ukraine. I've always been skeptical of the argument that this is a sort of 1930s Germany and he's got to be stopped now or he's going to march everywhere. Apart from anything, and you've already talked about this, the astonishing damage that we have done to his military already in Ukraine. You know the joke. We used to think Russia had the second most powerful military in the world. Now we know it only has the second most powerful military in Ukraine. The idea, again, having demonstrated, quite frankly, its limited military capability, in fact, its military ineptitude against Ukraine, again, no offense whatsoever to the Ukrainians who fought incredibly bravely, but it's Ukraine. Really think he's going to really risk, after all of that, taking on NATO? With all of that, I take your caveats about will NATO really fight? Will Trump really authorize it? You really think he would take that risk after everything that he's already suffered in just fighting Ukraine?
Well, I think this will be the ultimate prize. If he could actually destroy the credibility of NATO, he comes out a massive winner. And by the way, so let's say he gets Ukraine, that he wins in Ukraine. What happens to all those weapons that we supply the Ukrainians? They become Russian weapons. What happens to all the Ukrainian soldiers who are highly trained? They become Russian soldiers. And by the way, he doesn't care about losses. And so he doesn't care about the amount of money he's spending. He's selling oil, making money, using that money. He'll bring in foreign mercenaries. He'll do whatever he has to do. This is the ultimate prize. All of a sudden, he becomes, the most powerful man or the second most powerful man in the world if he does this. I think that there's every possibility that he does that.
You know Russia well, Bill, and you know Putin well. How close is the relationship with Xi Jinping of China? I mean, we saw big fanfare 3 years ago with the partnership without limits and all of that, and yet there clearly have been limits because China's not been militarily supportive in Ukraine. It's been economically and politically and diplomatically supportive. How close is that relationship? And a lot of people talk about this. We live in this age of a Cold War II, and that is a real alliance and real partnership. How important is that, do you think?
Well, I don't think there's any natural alliance between Russia and China. They're as different as you could be. They're sort of more natural enemies than natural allies. But for reasons of Putin's choosing, he decided to sort of cut his ties with the West and build his ties with China. And so what does China get out of this? They're just licking their lips, getting cheap natural resources, which they have a voracious appetite for. And the other thing that China gets from this is that they're at odds with America and with the West. And China loves doing these things where we exhaust ourselves financially and militarily. Well, they go and to a little African country, build them a road, and all of a sudden they own the African country. And so China can sit there and watch us, exhaust ourselves, weaken ourselves, spend all this money. And so they're weakening us, getting a bunch of free oil, and all they have to do is, veto a few things in the United Nations and sell a bunch of military equipment to the North Koreans and then on-sell it to the Russians. It's pretty good time for the Chinese.
You've already pointed out that Putin's been in power 25 years. He's disposed of opponents regularly, frequently. The last one, Alexei Navalny, we saw his departure. Other opponents like the Wagner guy, he seems to be pretty politically secure. Obviously, there's tight control over media, and so hostile media, hostile press doesn't really operate in Russia. How secure do you think he is? Again, you talked about this being his ultimate objective here, to stay in power and keep all of his hundreds of billions of dollars and all of his power. Is there any plausible challenge, threat? We saw with the Prigozhin, right? That brief period, 18 months ago, there could be something extraordinary happening. Do you think he's basically secure, or is there political risk for him?
Well, I think that there's a lot of risk for him. So he did these wars to raise his sort of popularity to be solid. And this war has gone catastrophically badly for him. And according to Ukrainian estimates, something like 820,000 soldiers have been either killed or maimed. They spent more than $1 trillion on military waste. They've wasted more than $1 trillion on equipment that's been destroyed. The inflation rate is above 20%. Interest rates are above 20%. The ruble is very, very weak. 1 million able-bodied Russian men who didn't want to be cannon fodder have left the country. It's a very brittle situation. Now, look, North Korea has survived 3 generations of dictator from the same family. He could survive till the end of his natural life, 15 years or 20 years from now.
Does he have a successor? Do you think? Does he have someone?
Absolutely not. Any successor would then take over. But look at what happened in Syria. It was such a lost cause that most people forgot about Syria. It was just too painful to even think about. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, and not necessarily out of nowhere, there's a lot of external factors, but Assad fell, was humiliated, and the country was taken over by, hopefully, a less brutal, I don't even know how to describe the new Syrian government. But what I can say is it's not Assad. And we've seen this happen time and time again. I remember going to Egypt when Mubarak he had been decades and decades. It was unimaginable. And then one day, he's not there. Dictators fall. They fall for reasons that when one can't expect. It all happens very quickly. So is that going to happen with Putin? Probably not. But the probability is well north of zero that something could happen at some point that's unexpected, which is part of the reason why he's running such a police state right now. If you say a bad word about him, you go to jail.
Was Assad's ouster a significant setback for Putin?
Completely. So he had been in Syria as a backer of Assad, and I think that gave him credibility to be a backer of other dictators, which gave him influence all over the place. And all of a sudden, he is humiliated. And I think, by the way, the fall of Syria and the humiliation that Putin has experienced very much feeds into how he deals with Ukraine. And again, he's not a guy who does humiliation well. And so to the extent that if he had any capacity to compromise, and as I've said, he doesn't, he sure ain't going to do it now after he's got to show his people he's a strong man, he's a tough guy, he's a leader, and that Syria wasn't an example of a trend that's to follow.
We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Bill Browder. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with Bill Browder, Sir William Browder, I should say. Let's talk more broadly in the time we have remaining about the new administration, about what we can expect in terms of the rest of the world, in terms of foreign policy. You've done the opposite journey from me. You're an American who's become a Brit. Congratulations on your knighthood. We're here in Davos. It's been dominated by the inauguration this week. The mood in Europe for a long time has been, let's be honest, horror and terror about Trump, right? They're terrified over NATO. They're terrified of his apparent, affinity for Putin and other sort of strongmen, newly terrified about the trade threat and the threat of tariffs and all of that, and indeed about his general, what seems to be sort of almost kind of intellectual hostility to the European Union. What's your sense, both your own sense and your sense from talking to people, of what now the expectations are now that Trump is here, he's there, he is president, he's starting again, we're talking about these tariffs and everything else. How do you think this is going to play out?
Well, I think the difference between now and 2016 is 2016, he was like as surprised as everyone that he won. And he hadn't created a transition team or a plan 2025 or, any of that kind of stuff. This time around, he's fully prepared. He's thought it through. He's set up a sort of shadow administration early. And so I think we have to take seriously everything he says right now and try to figure out how much of it is extreme negotiating position and how much of it is reality. And if he follows through with some of the stuff he says he's going to follow through with, it's certainly catastrophic for America.
Talking there about tariffs, maybe this latest NATO 5% military demand.
That I think he's right about. Europeans shouldn't be relying on Americans. But to impose massive tariffs on Canada, I just don't understand where that comes from and how that serves any American interest, because what's Canada going to do? They have to retaliate. And that's like total mutually assured economic destruction.
Well, as you said, the aim with all these things, the deal, right? And it's always, you go for the maximum position. You lay out, this is the classic art of the deal stuff. You lay out the most extreme position, especially, you terrify the other side and they agree to something which actually looks like a reasonably good deal. Is that not what he's doing here?
Well, interesting with the Canada, he negotiated the last deal. So he's like so upset about the last deal he negotiated. It's sort of crazy. So, what's going to happen with Canada? Here in Davos, I had dinner with a bunch of Canadians on my first night, and they sort of walked me through what Canada supplies to the United States and what they would do and what America supplies to Canada. And it will be an economic disaster if Trump follows through on this tariff threat.
Because Canada would retaliate.
They would retaliate, and it would cost Canada like 4% of their GDP, but, inflation would probably go up, 250 basis points in America.
So the argument, obviously, the U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada. I'm very, very simplistically here, but, and I oversimplistically, but the argument is the U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada. If you do get into a tariff war with them, then, the country, arguably, that has the trade deficit that's doing more of the importing, is going to substitute more domestic production, and that's obviously the aim here, and you will get a more balanced trading relationship.
Well, that's like highly simplistic. So, what Canada supplies, America can't supply, and therefore America will have to buy those things at a 25% premium, and that will cause inflation. Not to mention the fact that Canada buys stuff from America. They will then slap tariffs on that kind of stuff. And then there's, of course, all sorts of other second and third order effects. And so what's going to happen is any reasonable person looking at this is going to say, well, this is insanity. We can't do that. And by the way, as far as I understand, the real executive order says that Canadian trade agreement will be studied and then come up with a plan in 3 months. And so what will happen in 3 months is they sit down and have a negotiation. I'm sure the Canadians will, relent on a couple of issues just to give them a win. And then I would hope that that's how it all plays itself out.
We'll talk about some of the larger stuff with Europe. Just briefly on Greenland. Who'd have thought we'd be spending so much time talking about Greenland? That when you talk to people, it's not a crazy idea. There are lots of things that the US wants from Greenland. Mineral rights, obviously. Some, greater enhanced defense capabilities given the potential for sort of Arctic conflict. Is it a good idea for the US to sort of basically start threatening to take Greenland away from Denmark?
I think the Danes would be really happy to have, as I understand it, and I've spoken to Danes and people who are close to the situation, if America wants to set up 5 military bases on Greenland, God bless America. I'm sure the Danes would be very happy to do that. If America wants to exploit natural resources in Greenland, I'm sure that that's all open for conversation. The problem with this announcement that Trump wants to take over Greenland is that it justifies Putin's taking over Ukraine, and it justifies the Chinese taking over Taiwan. And, we should be living in a world where sovereignty and borders, are sacrosanct. And to start challenging that, just those conversations, that may be part of the art of the deal, but that conversation is very destructive.
And on Europe in general, again, we've talked briefly, I think a lot of people, as you say, agree with Trump that obviously the Europeans need to do much more in terms of their own military contributions to NATO. But on the wider question, and again, we've already touched on this in the context of Russia and maybe Russia being tempted to at least test the strength of the NATO alliance. What's the mood in Europe? My impression is I don't detect a lot of optimism that NATO is here. What's your sense? Is NATO essentially becoming a dead letter?
Well, I think if America continues to be, the dominant force in NATO, then NATO is NATO, which is, it's always been NATO. If America withdraws or creates some uncertainty about the Article 5 mutual defense mechanism, then NATO loses its peacekeeping power of keeping the bad guys at bay. The problem with Europe is that there's no such thing as Europe, really. there's a European Union, but each country has its own ideas. There are some countries with good ideas and some countries with bad ideas, and it's like herding cats. And particularly at the moment, there's no leadership. The Germans are going through an election. Scholz can't make decisions. He's the biggest economy in Europe, and the French are sort of looking inwards because they're having their own problems. And so the British are no longer part of the EU. And so it's just a bunch of people in a committee, and committees don't make robust decisions. And this is a moment when you need robust decisions. Europe should have its own defense capabilities with or without NATO.
But you can't have that kind of capability without economic strength, and that is the fundamental part of Europe. And one of the things we've been discussing with everybody this week is, again, whatever one thinks of the politics in the US and whatever one thinks of some of the issues about that Trump is raising, the dynamism and strength of the US economy and the relative stagnant state of the European economy, that gap, that divergence seems to get greater and greater by the year. Do you sense any, and again, as I say, you're British, you spend a lot of time in Europe, do you get any sense at all, and we had the Draghi report last year with all its recommendations for restoring European growth and dynamism, do you get any sense at all that they have the political will to really make fundamental changes?
No, there's no they. It's just this committee and a bunch of people all arguing in a committee, 27 countries and everybody sort of going off in different directions. There's no they. The thing that America has going for it is it's one country, and the main thing it has going for it is it's got an unbelievably deep capital market. And so you have this capital formation. And so anybody who wants to start a business can borrow money, get venture capital, do all this kind of stuff. In Europe, it just doesn't exist. There's all these little countries with no capital markets. And so as a result, it's sort of capital starved. And as a result of it being capital starved, then any good person with a good idea wants to go get their money from America, go set up a business in America, et cetera. And so it seems like a very hard hurdle to clear. Having said all that, where do people want to live? They want to live in either America or Europe. These are wealthy countries compared to everywhere else in the world. So while we're all sort of talking about economic dynamism, people who are emigrating from China, they either come to Europe or they come to America because these are better places to live. There's better standards of living. There's a higher quality of life.
Lifestyle superpowers, yes, in Europe, whatever else they may be. Bill, final question. You've spent a lot of time in Russia. You spent a lot of time dealing with Putin himself and, of course, dealing with the oligarchs and the kind of power structure around him and the relationship between political and business power and money in Russia. We've just, obviously, again, Donald Trump's just become president. And as you well know, there's been some expressions of concern about some of the business people around Donald Trump, the money that he's been able to raise from people like Elon Musk. We saw this quite remarkable display at the inauguration of these tech giants, Bezos and Musk and Sundar Pichai. I don't want to sort of put words in your mouth or overstate it. Is the US developing a kind of political business complex? Joe Biden in his farewell address warned about this oligarchy that's being formed. Do you see kind of elements of a sort of Putin-esque oligarchy developing in the USA?
Well, I think there's a long way to go for the U.S. to become like Russia. Russia had no rule of law, no property rights, no courts. The oligarchs stole everything from everybody, killed people, got away with it. Is that happening in the United States? No. On one hand, it's good for the government to promote the most successful businesses. I wish that in the UK they were more business-oriented right now. It seems like all the producers in the UK don't want to be in the UK anymore because they feel like the government's not pro-business. But I do think that there's huge conflicts of interest between these business people and the government. And one of the reasons why Russia didn't work is because government's job is to promote capitalism and regulate capitalism. Because if you allow capitalism to go unfettered, then you end up with these situations where in Russia, 22 individuals controlled 40% of the GDP of Russia. And by the way, what that does is not good for business, because in a democracy, the pendulum will swing the other way. And if we let such a small number of people use their connections to benefit themselves at the expense of the average person, then the next election or the next election after that, the pendulum is going to swing so far the other way that, that socialism will look centrist in America. And that's how these pendulums work. And so anybody who really believes in long-term sustainable business should not be happy about conflicts of interest between the biggest business and government, which benefits those biggest business people.
And taking the longer view, big business in America has always, at least for the last 120, 130 years, let's say, both, sought proximity to government and in some ways to gain benefits from government. And one thinks about JP Morgan or Rockefeller, or we've had legislative measures and others against those things. But maybe we're just going through another period with a different group of very powerful, very wealthy business leaders. And as you say, that time will pass too.
It'll pass, but the problem is that if the situation gets too extreme, then the political blowback is going to be very painful for all the people who value capitalism, free markets, and all that kind of stuff.
Bill Browder, thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression. Join us next week when we'll have another discussion about the big topics that are facing the US and the world. In the meantime, have a great week. Speak to you soon.